Now back to the show. This is The Law Show on CL 650.
We can work it out. We can work it out. Life is very short and there's no time.
Hey, welcome back to The Law Show. I'm Zach Spencer. You're listening to CL 650. And on this show, we're talking about immigration and citizenship law with Rudy Kisher and Alex Stojkovic from MKS in downtown Vancouver, moving at the end of the month right onto what street?
688 West Hastings.
Hastings, right next to the iconic Burke's building on the corner of Granville there. Now we have a situation where we have a new government coming in. You have a new minister, and what typically happens, I guess, is that the minister has to get up to speed on his portfolio, his or her portfolio. So the people that give the minister that education are the senior bureaucrats, which would beg the question: who really has more power? Is it the minister in charge of the file, or is it the long-term senior bureaucrats that have been there and influence maybe the decision of the minister? In your opinion, what do you think happens there?
Well, I think it's it's a big tug of war, I think, because the minister comes in. It's a very complicated area. There's a lot of background. They don't know the history, so they're going to depend on their senior bureaucrats to bring them up to speed. Now, what that information is and what they put forward as the issues is definitely going to influence the minister, and he's got to make a decision in terms of what his priorities and how he wants to run. And if he's not careful with bringing the department on side, he's going to have a hard time, because you can give those marching orders. And I'll give you an example of what happened in terms of if you're trying to change something. For example, the ability of somebody to come into the border, can they have what's called dual intent? Right? So, used to have the immigration officers at the border how to make a decision. If you're coming in, are you coming with the intention to immigrate? Well, you're coming in with a work permit, let's say, or as a student. You may have in the back of your head a long-term to immigrate, but for the longest time, you couldn't even mention that. If you so much as said, I'm thinking about immigrating in the future, the enforcement level at the border would sort of overreact and say, well, you're an intending immigrant, to the point that despite the sort of, and the minister tried to get the word out and say, listen, we've got to be facilitative of the border. You guys can't be reacting like this.
But that
also actually changed the act.
But that also goes to the point where you're saying we have this system where we want to keep these students
Yeah.
who come for 2 or 3 years to end up becoming Canadians. So that's a bit of a push-pull, right?
It's a total push-pull. Yeah.
The challenge here is one of process. So in this particular instance, with this transition in government, the new party in power actually had a platform on immigration that was largely influenced by discussions with stakeholder groups, with an effort at their policy conventions to come up with something that was rivaling what was the status quo, and they announced what they were going to do as part of the election campaign. So from that perspective, it's pretty transparent, and they see the role of the bureaucracy as informing them, pointing out pitfalls along the way, and then maybe in terms of big picture issues, trying to move some of their policy agenda items forward, but at the same time addressing the concerns that the department sees as concerns, either the Immigration, Refugee, Citizenship Group, which is one department now, or Canada Border Services. With the last government, you had a slightly different approach. First, you had goals that you wanted to achieve, and the bureaucracy was seen, by some anyway, as being an obstacle to those goals, especially in terms of the law and order agenda. So as a result, the bureaucrats there, depending on what other than implementation, in terms of policy making, their role was different, because they were told, here, regardless of what you think the issues are, we're going to see them in a prism of what will hurt us politically, as well as what really needs fixing. And it's always a trade-off between those two things. I mean, some would argue that the department's role has been diminished compared to before, because the tone, or the ideological tone, of the Conservative Party being much more anti-Ottawa as a general rule, and the control of the Prime Minister's office on the immigration file. And others would say that in previous governments, the bureaucracy actually led the department by telling the minister only what the minister needed to know, if you will, and really dictating policy directly. Between those two extremes, there's always going to be middle ground, and I think that's going to continue as we go forward. because this is a complex area, and each department that's involved in it has a different organizational approach, different operations mandate, different culture. I mean, certainly some departments have enjoyed a lot more profile. I mean, under the previous government, there was a lot of advertising of what Canada Border Services did. They had that TV show Border Security that they co-sponsored. They would publish the lists of most wanted. They would tell you quite proudly how many people they deported. I mean, they made those statistics public, which had never been before. You know, like I think in 2014 we deported something like 15, or no, it was 22,000 people, something like that. Whereas in 1999, first time I ever saw a statistic was like 5,400 out of Canada. So this is an approach that was popular with some elements at Canada Border Services. At the same time, that's not necessarily going to work within the operational mandate or culture of different groups. And certainly you see from the bureaucrats themselves, the refugee program is being popular from that perspective because it was an opportunity for them, instead of being enforcement minded, to do a big project that was seen as a part of the public good. So those tensions will always remain. And in this case, this government has the advantage of having an agenda already that has been put forward, and a minister who's been told what the mandate will be based on what the platform
and then
was
the bureaucrats assist in implementing that.
Exactly.
I mean, the interesting in this case is Trudeau gave the ministers their sort of marching orders in a letter, right? He set it out and said, this is your mandate letter. And
that was
and
made
set
public.
Out it was made public and put it online so everybody can see. I've told Minister McCallum these are the 6 things I want him to focus on. And he's, you know, I think he's a very intelligent man. He's strong-willed. He's been in politics a long time. So I think they've got the right guy for the job. And, you know, I think they're going to have to contend with sort of, he's got a vision that he wants imprinted on. How effective he is and, you know, bringing the bureaucrats along with that remains to be seen.
What the other side of the coin would say, and I'm not putting my views out here necessarily, but the other side would say, well, it's easy for them. We handled all of the tough issues. We made all of the difficult decisions. They're now just moving the debate slightly left or right from all of the things that we tackled for them.
What would some of those hard issues be?
Oh,
well,
my God, backlog. So to give you an example, if you were applying to immigrate out of China at one point, you know, you had processing time. So if someone wants to immigrate, they make the application. They could be sitting for 5 to 6 years. And in some posts, they ended up waiting 10 years in Africa. So they basically had a system in which they were selling tickets to get on the plane, but they could only take 250,000 people a year. But
so
they kept selling tickets.
What did the Conservatives do to fix that?
They basically made a system responsive to ministers' instructions, and with this express entry, they only accept as many applications as they can process that year. So then they take your application, they're guaranteeing we're going to process
within
it in
that
6
year.
months.
Right.
In 6
Oh,
months.
6 months, okay.
Right? So they've basically made a system now that kind of runs in a functional. I mean, I think it works great in some respects, in the sense that people haven't paid their money or thinking they're going to come to Canada.
And sitting waiting for years.
10 years,
Yeah.
a decade. I mean, it was absolutely ridiculous. And the government was having to pay to sort of handle that file, to store that file, and then to look at it 10 years down the road. Are you still interested in coming to Canada? Oh, I can't find you. I've got to email you. I mean, what a joke.
Yeah.
So I mean, those are some of the. I mean, both of those views are legitimate. I mean, the one side would say, well, listen, there was too much in terms of this problem, that problem. We needed to address it. And the other side will say, well, you're really talking about tinkering. You're not talking about wholesale changes. Well, that's if you're sitting in the queue waiting for your spouse in Canada, and this government, which the current one, is going to invest in cutting that processing time down from 26 months on average.
That's a win for you, right?
To 6 months. That's a win for you.
Yeah.
And you don't care if that's tinkering, quote unquote, or a big change or not. And then when it comes down to it, when people who are the end users of this system will judge who has had the better outcome to some extent, as well as society in general. And you know, long term, it's going to come down to how responsive the system is overall, how quickly they bring people in, and how reflective those decisions are of Canadian values. And,
I mean, I think the big problem that the current minister is facing, with having delivered on his promise of 25,000 refugees coming in, how does he do the next step in terms of bringing down these, as you mentioned, the processing time for spouses? Is he going to be able to whip that initiative? Because now somebody in Canada, you can imagine if I'm sitting there and I'm waiting for my wife to get her permanent residency, and I'm waiting 2 years. Meanwhile, in 3 months, you can bring somebody who's never paid a lick of tax dollars to come to Canada.
Yeah,
why can't you do that?
What do you say to that person, especially if they're a tax filer? And then this brings us to another issue that we wanted to address a little bit today. PR cards. In the system, the way it's been set up, if your card expires, you have to go and apply to renew it. So renewals now take an average routine case 157 days. That's to renew a document that's like a driver's license for some people. In a federal bureaucracy where it's processed in Sydney, Nova Scotia, where you're already being asked a lot of questions and you have to provide a lot of paper, it's taking 157 days. And people have limits on their ability to travel while they're waiting for this to be processed, on their ability to renew medical coverage in BC, their driver's licenses,
Everything
mortgages, everything in their life, because they don't have the primary form of documentation that identifies them as being a permanent
That
resident.
the Act says the government has an obligation to provide to them.
Well, you
and
can
makes
see
it
what
great.
people get their nose out of joint when, you can do a big project like refugees, but what about the people who are here already?
Exactly.
Right, and that's not a small number of people. It's the hundreds of thousands of people.
In their last minute here, what do you guys see for our next show? What do you think we're going to be picking up on?
Oh, I think we're going to be talking about the amount of U.S. Refugees that we're going to be seeing.
You think it's going to
I think, I think the numbers, the barometer is already rising, as the rhetoric rises from the South. So we'll see what happens.
Well, we're going to be in full swing with the election cycle there for sure. That's going to be interesting to watch. Well, it's always fascinating. I always learn so much from you guys when you come in. It's an interesting subject, and I'm sure the listeners listened very intently because there's a lot going on immigration and citizenship law. Our guests have been Rudy Kisher and Alex Stojkovic from MKS Law in downtown Vancouver. They're moving at the end of the month. The address again?
688 West Hastings and
Suite
Granville.
900.
All right. I'll come and see your view one day. I'm Zach Spencer. We're all out of time. You're listening to The Law Show on CL 650.